Okay, so a market obviously consists of demand and supply, but those concepts, they are actually quite complex. So let's start by talking about demand, but also another important concept, quantity demanded. And specifically, let's begin with what we call the law of demand. The law of demand states that there is an inverse relationship between the price and quantity demanded. So what is important now to already note is that there's obviously a difference between demand and the term quantity demanded. So the demand is this entire curve. So the demand is also sometimes called the demand schedule. So the demand schedule informs about all possible combinations between a price and quantity demanded. So the demand is this entire curve. I'll make it a little bit bigger. So this, which is now a blue line, this is the entire demand. But when I say at the price of P equals 9, quantity demanded is 1. So that means when the price is 9, so then if the price is 9, quantity demanded is just this dot. So maybe I give it a different color. And I'll make the outline red too. Okay, so this red dot is the quantity demanded at the price of 9. And at the price of 6, quantity demanded is, so we go to 6, quantity demanded is 4. At the price of 3, quantity demanded is 7. So what happens is that the demand curve captures an individual marginal willingness to pay for a certain quantity. So where does a quantity demanded come from? So why is it that the more you have already consumed, why do people pay less? So if, let's say, somebody at the price of 3 and a quantity of 7, what that means is that if somebody wants to have an 1/8 unit of a good Q, then my willingness to pay goes down. So that is the law of diminishing marginal utility. So if you as an individual have to decide, oh, I not have anything of, let's say, something that you really crave at the moment, and you can get the first one, so then your willingness to pay is much higher. But if you already had, let's say, we are talking about cookies, and you already had 6 cookies, well, for the 7th cookie, your willingness to pay is much less. So the demand function, your individual demand function, can be thought of as your extra utility that you get from consuming another unit. So when you go, let's say, to a restaurant and you want to have, your first drink, you probably crave that a lot, and your willingness to pay for the first drink is much higher. But then if you already had a drink and you want the second one, then the extra utility that you get from a second drink is much less. And from a third drink it's even less. So what happens is that we get from each extra unit of consumption less and less extra utility. And that is somewhat captured in that individual demand function that somebody may have. And another term or another expression for the marginal utility at any given point of consumption that ultimately defines your willingness to pay, that is your reservation price. Your willingness to pay is your reservation price. So let's say this individual would consume the first unit and would have a maximum willingness to pay of 9. So that's the reservation price. Of course, that individual would be happy not to pay 9 for the first unit, but maybe only, probably nothing, but the lower the price, the better it would be. But 9 is the reservation price. For a third unit, the reservation price would be 7. Okay, so now, again, the demand function is this entire schedule, and the quantity demanded is a individual unit or amount demanded at a given price. So the demand schedule, the demand is everything, and the quantity demanded is a point on the demand curve. Okay, so now next, what is a demand function? So a demand function displays mathematically the relationship between the price and quantity demanded. So now, here you can see 3 demand functions. And now I also want to quickly address a certain idiosyncrasy in economics, which is we normally state that the quantity demanded, let's call that Q. So the quantity demanded is a function of the price. So we say Q is a function of the price, Q of P. And so that means that the quantity demanded, that is what we call the dependent variable. So we say that the quantity dependent variable, so we say that the quantity demanded depends on the price. And the price would then be the independent variable. Okay, so now by mathematical convention, and it's typically like this, that the dependent variable is typically displayed on the y-axis. So here we have the dependent variable, and the independent variable is typically displayed on the x-axis. So typically we call the dependent variable y and the independent variable x. But in this case we say, well, the quantity demanded depends on the price, so we would normally expect that we display the price on the y-axis. that we display the quantity on the y-axis and the price on the x-axis. But in economics we do it just the other way around. We display the price on the y-axis and the quantity demanded on the x-axis, even though the quantity demanded is our dependent variable and that is our independent variable. So that is a common practice in economics that definitely deviates from standard mathematical practice. But the reason why we do that will become obvious later when we also analyze certain areas associated with demand curves and supply curves. And specifically when we do welfare analysis, we can highlight certain areas that become more intuitive if we display the price on the y-axis and quantity demanded on the x-axis. But at this point what you should know is that it's definitely a little bit of a deviation from standard mathematical conventions, because we say the quantity demand is a function of the price, So we would expect quantity demanded on the y-axis and the price on the x-axis, but we display the price on the y-axis and the quantity demanded on the x-axis. And the reason why we do that will become obvious later when we also analyze areas underneath various curves. So now we have here a demand function. So the demand function is Q equals 10 minus P. And that is what we call the demand function. So this is a demand function because Q is to the left side of the equal sign. So that is a demand function. But as I just mentioned, well, we display it differently. We actually have the price on the y-axis. So what we need to do is we need to convert the demand function such that we don't have Q to the left side of the equal sign, but the price. And if we do that, we can rearrange this term. And if we put the price to the left side of the equal sign, we get the price equals 10 minus Q. And that is what we now call the inverse demand function. So this is the inverse demand function. So whenever the price comes to the left side of the equal sign, that is what we call the inverse demand function. So now if you want to take the inverse demand function here, Q equals 4 minus 0.5 P, well, if we look at this graph, then, because this is normally the y-axis, now if we tilt our head like this, I can see, oh, okay, here is the intercept of 4, and this has a slope of 1/2. So therefore the inverse demand function is this one here, P equals 8 minus 2Q. So if you rearrange this mathematically, you also get then P equals 8 minus 2Q. But again, if you tilt your head like this and you just look at Q equals 4 minus 0.5 P, you can see, oh, here's the intercept, and that has a slope of 1/2. So whenever you go this direction, you go half here. And the last one is Q equals 8 minus 2P. So Q has an intercept, this demand function has the intercept here at 8, and then minus 2P, so that would be this one. So if we rearrange this term, we can put 2P on one side, and then we can rearrange terms like this. 2P equals 8 minus Q, and then I divide both sides by 2, and then you get P equals 4 minus 0.5 Q. So those are the inverse demand function, and we also see them here. So the trick is that we need to rearrange a demand function such that the price stands to the left side of the equal sign, and then we get to the so-called inverse demand function. Okay, so now there are determinants of demand. And what we mean by a determinant of demand is that the entire demand curve shifts. So if we go back to the earlier slide, a change in demand would be this. So now if the entire demand curve shifts to the right, like this is what we call an increase in demand. And likewise, if it shifts to the left, that is what we call a decrease in demand. So determinants of demand are shifters of demand. That's another word of it. So shifters. And so what are those determinants? So again, a change in quantity demanded means a movement along the demand curve. So a change in quantity demanded is moving along a given demand curve. a shift in demand is this, and a change in quantity demanded is anything like this. So that means that the only determinant of quantity demanded is the price. So that is a little bit important. So the only determinant of quantity demanded is the price. But a shift in demand can have many reasons. So, and again, an increase of demand is a rightward shift, and a decrease in demand is a leftward shift of the curve. So what are the determinants of demand? Well, they are specifically income, and then closely related wealth, and then preferences and expectations, and price changes of related products, specifically substitutes and complements. And I want to do an example for each of them. Okay. So now here we see an increase of demand. So if I just overlay again a demand function here, so let's say we start with this function. Let's make it a little bit bigger. So if this is our demand function, then an increase of demand would be moving from here to there. So that's an increase in demand. So now we need to distinguish two kinds of goods. Normally, let's say this is the price of a good like fancy restaurants. And if let's say the price in a fancy restaurant for a meal is 6, so let's say this is the current price. The current price is 6. So then the quantity demanded at the price of 6 is currently 2. Well, if you become richer and you have a higher income, even if the price at the fancy restaurant stays 6, well, you will now demand maybe 4 because you have a higher income. So income is a determinant of demand and a shifter of demand. But now we got to be careful. So in a fancy restaurant, you probably go more often to a fancy restaurant if you have an income, if you have higher income. But let's say this is the market for ramen noodles or instant noodles. Well, it seems unlikely that, let's say, currently instant noodles cost 2 and your quantity demanded is 6. Well, if you become richer, it seems unlikely that you are demanding now more instant noodles. That's not going to happen. But if you become richer and it comes to instant noodles, your demand function for instant noodles probably goes down. And when that is the case, we call that an inferior good. So that's important. A normal good is a good where demand increases as income increases. And an inferior good is a good that you will demand less when your income goes up. So a normal good would be like a fancy restaurant, and an inferior good would be maybe instant noodles. Okay. So in other words, the increase of demand could be the result of an increase of an income for a normal good, or the result of a decrease of income for an inferior good, right? So let's say if you become poorer, then you also would demand more instant noodles. But let's not hope that this is the case. Okay, but I hope it's clear the difference between normal and inferior goods, and how income is a determinant of demand. Okay, so the next is, how do expectations and preferences affect demand? So expectations are, let's say, we assume that the war breaks out in the Middle East and people expect fuel prices to go up soon. So then, as a result of the expectation that fuel prices go up soon, people already start buying more today. So they will start hoarding. And that is an increase in demand. So let's say this would be the concept of hoarding. Or I think there was that phenomenon during the COVID crisis that people were stocking up on toilet paper because they expected that toilet paper will be in short supply. So expectations can shift the demand curve. And generally it's like this, whenever prices are expected to go up, or people expect the disruption of supply, hoarding activity set in, which is equivalent to a rightward shift of demand. Okay, so that's expectations. And what about preferences? So assume that new research shows that eating meat is bad for you, for your health, but eating fish is good for your health. Well, as a result of this study, people develop a stronger preference for fish and a lesser preference for beef. And as a result of the change of preferences, the demand curve for beef shifts to the left, because that's now bad for you, and the demand curve for fish, which is presumably better for you, now shifts to the right. So that's pretty straightforward. Okay, an interesting case that is not only very relevant, but also very useful in order to remember the difference between demand and quantity demanded, is how prices of related goods affect demand. So let me overlay again here quickly a demand function. And let's also add okay, so let's say we have two demand functions, and the demand functions are for two complements. Let's say beef and potatoes, those are complements. Or other complements are peanut butter and jelly, or French fries and ketchup. So beef and potatoes are complements. So what happens, ceteris paribus, which means holding everything else constant, in the market for beef and potatoes, if the price for beef decreases from 4 to 2. Okay, so in the market for beef, the price is currently 4. Quantity demanded is 2. So now the only thing that happens is that this price goes down to 2. And as a result of the decrease in that price, what happens is that quantity demanded for beef goes up to 4. But now, because people eat more beef, and they typically have beef with mashed potatoes, that means even if the price stays the same, potatoes didn't get more expensive or cheaper, there will be more demand for potatoes. So in other words, what happens is that when the price for beef goes down, quantity demanded for beef goes up and demand for potatoes goes up. So you see the difference between quantity demanded and demand. So again, what happens is quantity demanded for beef goes down and demand for potatoes goes up. So that is the case when we have a complement. And when it comes to a complement, there is obviously an inverse relationship, because when the price for beef goes down, demand for potatoes goes up. Okay, so now that is the case of a complement, and now let's do the case of a substitute. It's very similar. So let's first add again our okay, let's make that bigger again here, format shape. And also let's add again a point. Okay, so now we have a similar scenario, but now we have two substitutes. So let's say initially our demand function for apples is the blue line, and the price is initially 4. And our initial demand function for pears, a substitute of apples, is the other blue line. Okay, so now what happens is that the price for apples goes down, and as a result of that, quantity demanded of apples increases again from 2 to 4. But now more apple consumption drives out pears consumption, which means that even if the price for pears stays the same, let's say it still stays 2, then instead of eating 4 pears, people eat now only 2 because they eat more apples. So when it comes to a substitute, we have a direct relationship between the price of apples and the demand for pears. In other words, when the price for apples goes down, demand for pears goes down too. In the previous example, for complements, we said when the price for beef goes down, then demand for potatoes goes up. Okay, so I hope that is clear. So we have now seen income as a shifter of demand or a determinant of demand. And when it comes to income, it was important to distinguish between normal goods and inferior goods. Higher incomes, more demand, normal good. Higher incomes, less demand, then it must be an inferior good. Okay, so, and then we talked about expectations and preferences. That's also pretty straightforward. And also prices of related goods. Those are all shifters of demand. Okay, so now the final aspect is that we have so far only talked about individual demand functions. So, like we had 3 people and we looked at their demand functions. So we can think of it, of 3 different demand functions, like here A, B, and C. And A's demand function suggests that A has a very high willingness to pay for that good, or very high reservation price. And in fact, A would already buy some amounts at any price between 15 and 10. Individual B would only start buying that good if the price is less than B. And individual C would buy only that good if the price is less than 5. Okay, so those are individual demand functions. And so now what we can do is we can go from individual demand functions to the market demand function. And we do that by horizontally aggregating individual demand functions. So the market demand is the horizontal aggregation of individual demand functions. So now if we aggregate horizontally, we look at the price. Well, between 15 and 10, we have only individual A demanding. So that means that this section of A's demand function, which goes till 1 and which is red, so that part is only the relevant part for the market demand function. Okay, but now when it comes to the price of 10 and less, between the price of 10 and 5, both A and B demand. So now what we need to do is, if we want to aggregate horizontally, we just look at the price of 5. At the price of 5, A's quantity demanded is 2. And at the price of 5, B's quantity demanded is also 2. So that means that at a price of 5, total quantity demanded is 4. So that would be this section here. Okay, and finally, for every prices below 5, all three individuals A, B, and C demand. So now we just need to look at what is the total quantity demanded below 5 to 0. So at the price of 0, which is also called the saturation price, individual A would buy 3, or the quantity demanded would be 3, B 4, 3 plus 4 is 7, plus 5 is 12. So here, this section here would be A, B, and C. And that is how we get to the market demand function. Okay, so let's summarize again. So now we know the difference between demand and quantity demanded. Demand is the entire curve. Quantity demanded is a point on the demand curve. Then we talked about determinants of demand. Those are income, and if it's a normal good, a higher income shifts the demand curve to the right. If it's an inferior good, higher incomes shift the demand curve to the left. We also know that expectations and preferences are shifters of demand. And lastly, prices of related goods, where we distinguished between complements like beef and potato, and substitutes like apples and pears. And when the price for a complement goes down, like beef, then demand for the complement like potatoes also goes up. But if it's a substitute, so if the price for apples goes down, then demand for pears goes down. And lastly, you know how we get from individual demand functions to the market demand functions. And also the individual demand function captures people's individual marginal utility at any given consumption level. That is the demand function. And so every point on the individual demand function is a marginal utility. And that marginal utility also defines the reservation price, which is the maximum price that an individual is willing to pay for another unit. Okay, so let's stop here and let's just continue in the next video with supply and quantity supplied, which is very similar.